So you're visiting Stockholm and you want to see the best museums in the city? Then this video isn't for you. This is a video all about the worst museums in the capital of Sweden. Last year, I made a video about the worst museums I could find in Stockholm. It included some pretty awful ones, such as the Museum of Laundry, for example. But apparently, I missed a few. User Steamboat W offered some suggestions for even more museums I could visit. And let's just say that there are still some amazingly bad ones out there. Without further ado, let's get started on even more of the worst museums in Stockholm. In the middle of the 18th century, the merchant Claes Grill had a house built in the outskirts of Stockholm. This place is called Svindersvik and is one of Sweden's best preserved Rococo houses. It's not big enough to be a castle or a mansion, but it's bigger than a normal house. It's basically a predecessor to the summer houses of today. The house belongs to the Nordic Museum since the 1940s, but it's not a normal museum. You can visit the garden at any time, but the only way to see the inside of the house is to attend a guided walk. And these walks only occur during the summer months, so make sure you check it out before autumn starts. The last guided walk for this year was actually today, and I just missed it. But I'm not that sorry anyway, because, to be honest, this isn't much of a museum anyway. If you have a particular interest in Rococo design from the 1700s, well, then this might be interesting. But I'm gonna bet that most of you would feel a deep disappointment with a visit to Svindersvik. Sure, it might be interesting to look at some authentic details, like wallpaper made out of Chinese rice paper. And it might be interesting to have a look at a 1700s-style bedchamber. But I think we've all seen similar things in other, more interesting museums. I guess that the garden in a classical French style is pretty nice, and they have a cafe down by the water as well. All of this is pretty beautiful, but in the end, it's all just one rich guy's summer house. That's it. Svindersvik is very pretty, and it's also very dull. It really is one of the worst museums in Stockholm. Carl Michael Bellman was one of the most influential Swedish songwriters of all time. He was born in 1740 in Stockholm, and he has been compared to geniuses such as Mozart, Shakespeare, and Beethoven. And that's not me being a patriotic Swede. He really was quite a master of his craft. King Gustav III was a patron of Bellman, and he called him a master improviser. Bellman's songs still live on today. There's not a single Swede who doesn't know the tunes Fjäril Vingad or Gubben Noak. Horrible renditions of those songs can still be heard all over Sweden by children of all ages. The thing that makes Carl Michael Bellman a little bit unique is that many of his songs concern drinking, prostitution, or other sordid topics. It's all written in a flowery and beautiful Rococo style though, so sometimes you don't even realize what the song is really about. This risque master composer is an extremely interesting part of Swedish history, so it's a bit of a pity that this Bellman Museum is such a disappointment. Or at least that's what I was planning to say, but it turns out that this place is full of interesting facts and awesome live music. I thought that this was gonna be one of the worst museums in Stockholm, but I was utterly and completely mistaken. I can highly recommend a visit to Bellmanhuset, the house that Carl Michael Bellman lived in between 1770 and 1774. This is where Bellman wrote some of his most important songs, and these days the house is owned by Parbricol, a bacchanalian order dedicated to music and song and a lot of other stuff. I had a great time here, and I hope you'll visit it as well to learn more about one of the dirtiest and most impressive Swedish composers of all time. This was a bit of a bombshell, but I can't say that I'm disappointed. Bellmanhuset is definitely not one of the worst museums in Stockholm.
Om nu och fiskanoten är bunden, kom nu på stunden, skynda dig. Söta min lilla, tänk icke illa, skulle du vilja meka mig. Lät oss fara till det lilla grundet, eller dit bort till det lilla sundet, där vår kärlek knutit är förbundet, var över pils så halvar sig.
The Stockholm Dance Museum was founded in 1953 by Rolf de Marais, an art collector and celebrity within the Swedish cultural establishments. He led the Ballet Suédois in Paris between 1920 and 1925, and he also started the first dance research center in Paris as well. The research center was also a museum, and eventually he decided to move his entire collection to Stockholm instead. That was the origins of the dance museum. Rolf made the museum the sole heir to his wealth, so that it could continue to educate people about the marvels of dance for many, many years to come. And it's probably a good thing that he donated a lot of money, cause this museum is unlikely to draw a huge crowd of visitors by itself. I appreciate art and culture as much as the next guy. Or, well, maybe a bit less. But I have to admit that dance isn't really my favorite form of artistic expression. I'm not exactly a natural dancer myself. I'm sure that's shocking to hear, but it's true. And I don't understand all the finer details about dance either. To be honest, I kind of find the thought of a dance museum pretty unnecessary. Maybe I'm just not the target audience, but then again, I also don't see a huge crowd of visitors fighting for a chance to get into this museum to see all of these marvelous exhibits. This isn't exactly one of the most visited museums in Stockholm, and I also think that it's one of the worst museums in Stockholm. The Swedish Center for Architecture and Design is being reconstructed right now, and it's opening again in June 2024. But that's not gonna stop me from offering my less than stellar review of it anyway. I'm just gonna stand out here and insert clips from when I visited the museum another time. The ArkDes Museum was founded in 1962, and it has both permanent and temporary exhibitions. I visited back in 2020 when they had a temporary exhibition about ASMR called Weird Sensations Feel Good. I wouldn't say that I felt very good after visiting that one. More confused if anything. And the permanent exhibitions weren't all that interesting either, to be honest. It's all very modern, and maybe some people find it really fascinating and get inspired by all the, I don't know, complex emotions on display or something. I don't even know what I'm talking about, and that's my main problem with this museum. I'm a simple caveman who doesn't appreciate or understand all the finer details about modern design. For me, a museum like this is pearls for swine, and at least in my view, it's one of the most boring and worst museums in Stockholm. I mentioned that ArkDes is closed, so you might be wondering why there are so many people here. Well, it's right next door to the Modern Museum, but that's a completely different story. Don't get me started on that one. I got a few suggestions for even more bad museums, for example Julita Gård. That one looks really boring, but it's also really far away, like 2.5 hours from Stockholm, so I can't really count it as a museum in Stockholm. Tyresö Castle was another suggestion, but I actually think that the castle looks pretty cool. Also, it has a history that dates back to the 1300s, and it lies close to the lovely Tyresta National Park. Sorry, Steamboat W, but I don't think it qualifies to be among the worst museums in Stockholm. Personally, I also find some of the small art museums in Stockholm really boring as well, but I'm not gonna include them either. I'd probably get even more hate mail from elitist culture snobs if I did. Anyway, let's move on to the final entry in this list. The last museum on this list isn't actually a museum, but it calls itself a museum, so I'm gonna include it anyway. In the spring of 2022, a new museum opened in Stockholm called the Paradox Museum. This place has more than 70 experience-based installations that challenge the viewer's perception in various ways. This museum is all about creating engagement and fun. But the problem is that it's all just optical illusions and silly things for people to have fun and to take nice photos for Instagram. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. In fact, I love places like this. I always go to 3D museums and other types of optical illusions you can find at touristy destinations. It's a great way to have some fun, but it's not a museum experience. I will have learned nothing after this visit. Nada, zip, zilch. I've had a great time, yes, but I would have had that if I'd gone to a strip club as well, and you wouldn't exactly call that a museum, would you? For me at least, a museum must have educational content, otherwise it's just entertainment. For that reason, Paradox Museum is one of the worst museums in Stockholm, even if it's also a really fun place to visit. It's pretty ironic that there are people visiting from Paradox Interactive today here at the Paradox Museum. You know, the developers behind Crusader Kings, for example. And there you have it. Those were 5 of the worst museums in Stockholm. In case you missed my video from last year, make sure you watch it as well for even more truly awful museums. Either way, I hope you found this interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day. Oh, and up here in the corner is that video I was talking about. Make sure you have a look at it. I have a feeling it's gonna be right up your alley.